having a community, and especially a face-to-face community, is not just essential for learning. I think it's a precondition for it, because only through interactions, and especially meaningful interactions, and especially, I would say, intangible, meaningful interactions that take place when you do not expect them, you're actually truly learning. I always say to the students that I've worked with that they're going to learn much more from other students than in the classroom. And I think one of the key roles of faculty, especially those who run this type of programs, is to act as social and cultural impresarios, bringing in the right mix of people together. And this is what makes the process of learning not just meaningful, but also something that eventually continues way after programs have ended. So this is by way of introduction. I've been studying civil war for a long time, and I've been for a long time concerned about where civil war exactly fits into the larger universe of political violence. And this is what gave me this impetus for embarking on this project I'm going to talk to you about, which is a book project which tries to conceptualize, to understand, to reframe violent political conflict in a way that at least, and this is my main claim, makes sense to me, and hopefully to the rest of you as well. So I'm going to discuss the motivation for this project, what I propose as a way forward, and some of the, I think, potentially interesting and useful implications it has. There are many pathologies in the study of political violence. We have developed very sophisticated indicators for studying how various aspects of violence and political violence are evolving, but our concepts very often lack precision. They also lack clarity. There is considerable overlap between different kinds of concepts that people use, so that when we say, for example, that civil wars have increased or decreased, it's not clear exactly what is meant by that. Also, a lot of the research we do is fragmented across different disciplines, across different subfields within disciplines. I'm a political scientist, and for example, for many years I've been puzzled by the way in which people who study international relations and people who study comparative politics approach conflict in ways that do not seem to be compatible, very often speaking across each other. And that creates a situation in which a lot of what we're producing seems not to harmonize, to be cacophonous, if I may say so. On top of it, because of the way in which disciplines are organized, there is a tremendous premium for researchers on producing new knowledge, but not necessarily on synthesizing existing knowledge. There is a perception that if you try to put together things that others have done, that this is derivative is not rewarded as it should be, and as a result, there is less and less. So we have a tremendous amount of knowledge that is being produced, and not as much in terms of putting it together, making it speak to each other. The typical way of thinking today in terms of research is to try to understand the onset of some form of violent political conflict. It can be interstate war, it can be civil war, versus its counterfactual, which is its absence, which is perceived to be peace. You get rid of civil wars, you get domestic peace. You get rid of war, you get international peace. So peace is understood as the absence of violence, or even the absence of conflict, which is kind of problematic if you think that the essence of human life is managed conflict. And in fact, you would argue that democracy is a system that was invented in order to produce a peaceful management of conflict. So in reality, I would argue, peace is seen as the absence of a specific type of violent political conflict. So for people who study interstate war, once you have the end of wars between states, you have peace. But we know, from a perspective, say, of students of civil wars, that the end of a war between states may be the beginning of a set of wars within states, and so on and so forth. But because of the siloed nature of research, peace is perceived in this very fragmented way. So I would argue there seems to be a necessity that is clear to almost everyone, that integrating the study of political conflict is a useful thing to do, but at the same time, it also sounds daunting. We need more reliable knowledge. We can achieve that, I think, through this kind of integration. We can certainly generate new research agendas. And to show you how this perhaps can be achieved, I thought I would give you an overview of the history of our field, which is another thing we don't really understand, study, or even know. So I've thought of it as a history in 4 phases. The first one is the time in which modern social science emerges, the 1960s. And what is very interesting, which I discovered with quite a lot of surprise, is when people start studying the social science of conflict, they begin to study it in an integrated way, not in a fragmented way. The first canonical works of American political scientists who try to understand the causes of conflict approach it as a full-fledged phenomenon that covers a very wide range of particular phenomena, from, say, street protest on the one hand to nuclear war on the other hand. So they try to understand it in its totality. And this is, of course, overambitious, and it is based on a theological belief that the invention of the computer, which is going to allow data analysis to take place for the first time, is going to provide, very much like in the natural sciences, the solutions, the understandings for the causes of conflicts. There are a number of biases, however, at the time. There is a very clear demarcation, even though it's an integrated view of conflict, it excludes interstate conflict. So there is a very clear distinction between international conflict, international relations on the one hand, conflict between states, and everything else. It also focuses very much on violence that is focused and directed against the state. And therefore, there is a very big bias towards stability. The idea is that by studying violence, we're protecting existing regimes. So there's a conservative dimension to this approach. And this produces these kinds of arguments in which things like legitimacy produce efficacy, less legitimacy produces more strife, which to my mind, at least, sound very tautological and certainly devoid of insight. And of course, once things become more complicated, you get these kinds of diagrams in which everything affects everything. And it's not surprising that this research agenda vanishes. It hasn't really produced anything very strong and very stable. And as a result, not only it vanishes, but it is forgotten. People no longer remember this pioneering work that had a lot of very interesting things to offer. The second phase emerges in the traces of that first phase in the 1980s, and it is based on the idea that integration failed because it was too ambitious. And therefore, you have to split conflict in manageable pieces that are going to be chewed in a way that is more manageable. In a sense, there is very much this data drive, which is best expressed by the Correlates of War project at the University of Michigan, which is the idea that by coding every interstate war and crunching all the possible causes, we're going to discover what produces war, but of course done on a smaller scale. And of course, the other very interesting development is the so-called historical sociology turn that's very much connected with works such as Theda Skocpol's book on revolutions. And here there is a reversal of the bias. You study violence to understand how you can change politics, not how you can protect existing regimes, but how you can bring in meaningful social revolution. So the book by Theda Skocpol is an attempt to understanding social change that takes the form of revolution, with a focus very much on the big three social revolutions: Russia, China, and of course the French Revolution. It's a very macro-level book and a very macro-level agenda looking at states as unit of analysis. And there is a legacy that still exists, even though this kind of work no longer commands the same attention, which is very much based on what is known as contentious politics or social movements, the idea that organized citizen action outside of formal politics in the streets can have the kind of momentous effect on altering the political systems and the political agenda. So the bias here continues to be domestic, but now it's directed against existing regimes, and it's very much focused on change and not on stability. And it's a reflection with a lag, because academia always has a lag, of a movement that started in May 1968 in most of the developed world. The third phase begins with the end of the Cold War, the 2000s, and it's the triumph of civil wars. This is where I come in. This is when I started working on conflict, and it is based on an imitation of the cow approach to understanding the causes of interstate war, transposed into civil wars. It is very much based on the idea that we can understand the causes of civil war by using the same statistical analysis that we use for understanding interstate war. But at the same time, there is also a very interesting development, which is where I was very much involved, which I describe as the microdynamics turn, in which people try to understand what is going on within a civil war. Who are the actors? How are they organized? What they do to each other? How they interact? How organized groups interact with civilians? Basically, discovering the nuts and bolts of internal conflicts, rather than assuming that civil wars are basically versions of interstate wars writ small. The idea is that civil wars are fundamentally different from interstate wars. This creates, however, what is known in a variety of other fields in social sciences as a micro-macro gap. We have a lot of information about, for example, how states are more or less vulnerable to conflict. We have a lot of information about what goes on within states, but we cannot really put the two together. These are two universes that do not necessarily speak to each other. A lot of our findings at the micro level do not move up the scale at the macro level, and vice versa. A lot of the macro findings seem to be myopic or blind to the microdynamics. And so we're in the present. I should add here that if there is a political development that's associated with the third phase, if the first phase was associated with the rise of the United States on the global scale, if the second phase was associated with the global challenge of 1968 and the years that followed, the third phase was very much associated with the end of the Cold War. And so we are here in the fourth phase, and what we have is something that goes beyond the fragmentation of research. It's almost an atomization of research. There is an enormous amount of research at the micro level, which privileges methods over questions. So the idea is to try to measure various aspects of conflict and try to understand how each of those measures causes either the likelihood of conflict or other dependent variables, how intense, for example, a conflict is, how much violence there is, and so on and so forth. So you could call that a shift away from what is known as the causes of effects framework, understanding the causes of conflict, to what is known as the effects of causes framework, in which the idea is to estimate the effect of various potential dimensions. What is the effect, for example, of foreign assistance on the likelihood that the conflict is going to be intense or not? At the same time, we also have a very interesting movement away from civil war. I would say for the first time, other forms of political violence are receiving more attention. And I think that's one of the most interesting and promising developments. And this is certainly something that I would say 10 years ago I had not realized, that civil war is not the only or the main form of violence outside of interstate war. But the scope conditions of the various phenomena that are being studied are very often overlapping and unclear. And that results in this kind of fragmentation, which produces problems of limited external validity. Even the best identified, causally identified papers, very often it is not clear how they generalize and to what. And of course, that goes together with a poverty of theory, because the idea is always to estimate empirics. So this describes in a very sort of rough way the situation we're finding in which there is little interest in integration and synthesis. There's been some attempts to synthesize that material. I'll cite a book by Charles Tilly called Collective Political Violence, but they do not succeed. There is a lot of effort in the field of international human rights and humanitarian law, because there's obviously a very close connection between attempts at prosecuting violence and the categories we use, but it's a completely different universe from trying to actually understand the causes. And beyond that, there isn't that much, I would argue. So this is where I'm coming into trying to see how we can unify somehow all this very interesting but very fragmented work that is being done. Let's begin with a question. A few centuries ago, biologists faced the same problem when the discovery of new, quote unquote, of new continents introduced a tremendous amount of new species that needed to be categorized, classified in a common grid. The same kind of problem emerged. And biology is a very nice template for the problems we're facing. The problem of classification was one that was tackled initially by a Swedish scholar, Carl Linnaeus. And one of the things that you find when you read about the history of taxonomy is that it's basically contested. The field is extremely hostile. It is unfinished, and it's probably impossible. There are many different ways of classifying things that depend on what the point of beginning is, what the objective, what the goal is, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it's a task without which understanding is impossible. So here you have, I would argue, the two kind of constraints that we are facing. On the one hand, it's an impossible task. On the other hand, it's a necessary one. There is not a single way of doing it. One can classify conflict on the basis of any dimension you may pick. For example, I may decide that I'm going to classify armed conflict in terms of those that depend on modern weapons versus those that depend on traditional weapons. That's absolutely fine. And you can imagine an endless way of doing so. The way one can approach classification, I think, should be based on internal consistency. That is, no matter what one decides to make their main dimension, it has to be logically consistent. And you can think of it as a way to partition a set in which you create classes of things that are mutually exclusive and that together exhaust the full phenomenon. So that's the very basic way to think about it. So in a sense, you want to do the maximum. You want to try to cover most of the phenomena that we call conflict with the minimum amount of categories. You want to do the most with the least. That's the way to think about it. And the two elements that you want to achieve is, as I mentioned, joint exhaustiveness. So all the categories together exhaust the phenomenon. and mutual exclusivity. Once something is placed in one box, it cannot be in another box, which is very difficult, and we're going to see why. So the agenda is to produce integration rather than amalgamation, not just create a single category with everything, but at least have a theoretical way to distinguish between the fundamental categories. You want to simplify, because that's the objective, and that's the fundamental move of understanding versus complexifying everything. And you want to be both precise and flexible. So the way to be at the same time more ambitious but more modest is, I think, to let away the idea that we can figure out the natural laws of conflict in the way biologists can figure out the causes of life, or astronomers can figure out the causes of the universe. I think there is a fundamental difference between the social sciences where we are part of versus studying things that are outside of us. And I think if we let go of that ambition, we can actually be, I think, more successful in what we do. So what I'm trying to do with this, what I'm going to present, is to shift the question away from the causes of violent political conflict to understanding the shifts in the form of political conflict, why political conflict changes, takes and adopts different forms as opposed to what produces it in the first place. And that produces also a new research agenda in which we're asking about the causes and consequences of those shifts. For example, why would a war between states transform itself to a war within a state, or vice versa, as opposed to what causes a war? And in doing so, the modesty of this goal actually uncovers, I think, a very interesting dimension that has been forgotten in the study of the causes of conflict, that very often a certain type of conflict can cause another conflict. That is, the types of conflict can be themselves causes of conflict, which in the sort of structural understanding of conflict is something that has been put away. I'm not going to say much about definitions, but I'm very much intent on minimalist definitions. I understand politics as being a process of preserving, challenging, or acquiring rule or power. It's not something that I'm looking as an element that's diffuse in every aspect of human activity, but something that's very much associated with rule. And I think of violence as something that is very directly related to harm in a sort of direct way, as opposed to something that, again, is very diffuse. So, for example, using violence as a synonym of injustice, I don't think helps us, because then it increases the content of the term in a way that makes it intractable. What I want to do in order to try to push that agenda is to not do mistakes that people have done in the past. So, for example, Charles Tilly invented a system that was so complicated with new terms that it made little sense to people. So I'm trying to use existing terms and redefine them, tweak them a little bit. The idea is to improve on what we have as opposed to replacing everything that we have, and to be very clear in terms of the intuition of each term, and also to maximize coverage as much as possible. For example, there is no reason to separate international and domestic processes, states and non-states. The whole idea is to be efficient, to do more with less. The most important point that I want to emphasize is my approach focuses on macro phenomena. And so I want to explain what I mean by that. And the reason why I care about macro phenomena is because I care about history. I want to understand how things have evolved from the past into the present. So instead of using the present to peek into the future, I'm using the past in order to peek into the present. Macro phenomena are basically things that we describe as campaigns and not as single events. There are configurations of aggregate interactions between collective actors. So think of the difference between a war and a battle. A battle is a single event that takes place in a very specific time frame. A war is an aggregation of battles and of other things as well. So I'm very much interested in wars. These are the macro phenomena I have in mind, in campaigns as opposed to incidents. Those things that I care about, those categories, should exist independently at the macro level, even though, and this is one of the most interesting complications, but also advantages of this approach, they can appear inside other macro phenomena. But they have to exist independently to be classified or to be understood as macro phenomena, even though they can be subsumed under different phenomena. So a civil war very often takes place within an interstate war. During the Second World War, for example, there were many civil wars taking place. At the same time, however, civil wars exist and can be observed as independent phenomena. And that's why I think we can use civil war as a macro phenomenon. So that's a very important distinction. Terrorism is something that can appear in a civil war, but it can also exist as an independent campaign. And so a very nice proxy for the existence of those macro phenomena, which wouldn't be just my judgment, is the presence of a substantial literature. People usually care about these things because they have an important impact on society, and therefore we have substantial literatures existing to deal with them. What macro phenomena are not? Macro phenomena are not cleavages, the ways in which people organize themselves. So ethnicity is not a violent political conflict macro phenomenon in my understanding. They're not tactics. Guerrilla warfare is not one. They're not actors or groups. They're configurations of groups. They're not intentions or causes. They're not outcomes. And they're not repertoires. Torture is not a macro phenomenon because it's a repertoire of violence. Kidnapping or hijacking are things that you can observe in a variety of different settings. You cannot think of them as macro phenomena. And of course, incidents are not. And I think one of the biggest sources of confusion is the way in which we try to move in at the very basis of every kind of interaction, incidents or individuals, and theorize from there, rather than start from well-established configurations of events. And so if you want to think of three levels of analysis, macro, meso, and micro, what I want to focus on is that level. I'm not going to speak of, I'm not going to discuss, mesophenomena such as, for example, ethnic conflict or gender conflict, even though they inform macro phenomena, various tactics, various actors, focal points, electoral violence, which we discussed today in our workshop, and certainly not micro phenomena either. So the idea is to be located very much at that level. One could create classifications on every dimension. Okay, once we have defined the level of analysis, we have to solve a number of other, basically one other question, which is what is the basic criterion of distinction? The basic understanding, given that these are configurations, is that we have fundamentally two types of actors, states and non-states, that interact with each other. And there are two key dimensions of interaction. One dimension is access to political power, and the other dimension is the method that is being used to access it. And access means protecting it or trying to conquer it. There is no need for this classification to know anything about the nature of those actors, for example, the ethnic origin, their goals, their intentions, or their political cause or ideology. All you need is whether you can classify an actor as state or non-state, and what is the particular tactic that is being used to preserve or to win power. And we will see that tactic only varies when it comes to one particular dimension. So that produces a very straightforward and simple classification in which states can interact with other states, non-states can interact with other non-states, and states can interact with non-states. 3 types of interaction. So let's examine the first one, very straightforward. A state versus state conflict is called an interstate war. There is a very large literature on interstate wars. For a very long time, people who studied interstate wars called it war. And everything else was deemed unworthy of their attention. I think there is a historian of the 19th century who distinguished between war and murder. So everything that is not a war between states is just crime. The second type of interaction, non-states versus non-states, has been the focus of research, I would say, for the last 2 or 15 years. And it's very often referred to as intercommunal or communal violence. It's when groups of individuals that are connected with each other without being connected with the state engage into violence with each other. And finally, we are left with the biggest category, which is interactions between states and non-states. And here we have 2 versions. You have a situation in which challengers challenge the existing regime, and a situation in which regimes challenge their opposition. So basically, who has the initiative of sorts? And those define 2 fundamental forms of violence: rebellion, on the one hand, when challengers want to acquire power, and state violence, when the state tries to demobilize the opposition. If we were to disaggregate, and this is where the second dimension enters, the types of rebellion, we will see that they vary depending on the fundamental tactic of mobilization. I've identified 5 types of rebellion. I'll explain why the last one is in black. Militarized rebellion is when you raise an army to challenge the state. Civilian rebellion is when you organize the civilian population, or when the civilian population gets together spontaneously to challenge the state. Insider rebellion is when a group of insiders uses the state's resources to challenge the existing regime. Clandestine rebellion is a situation when a challenger uses clandestine tactics. And finally, criminal rebellion is a situation in which an actor is, and I'm going to explain that, very often associated with large level organized crime. Those correspond to 5 very well-known and understood types of conflict that have very large literatures associated with them: civil war, militarized rebellion; insurrection, what we call often revolution, which is the civilians attempt to conquer and challenge power; military coups, what I call inside the rebellion; terrorism, which I redefine as clandestine rebellion; and finally, organized crime violence. And if we look on the state side, again, there is a fundamental difference between what can be described as coercive state violence, the use of violence by the state to deter any action against the state, and then non-coercive state violence or demographic engineering, when the goal is eliminationist, when the objective is not to ensure that a certain group of people is not going to act against the state, but to completely eliminate it. And this is very often what we refer to as genocide or ethnic cleansing. So that defines the universe of violent political conflict. There's been a lot of confusion, a lot of political debate, a lot of bad blood, for example, in trying to describe what is going on in Israel-Palestine. Some people use the term genocide, other people use the term terrorism. It's become a sort of political marker. The same is true about almost every form of political violence. There is no ongoing civil war in which both sides of the conflict agree to call it a civil war. And so what I'm trying to do is, in a sense, produce a set of terms that are associated with well-known, well-understood, and well-studied phenomena, but can be tweaked to be made more precise so that we can actually describe what is going on in a way that is analytical without necessarily getting into the same political debates. There is a slight caveat, and this is why I'm using black instead of white. The 7 out of those 9 types that I've described only require those 2 criteria of knowing who is the state, who is the non-state, and what is the main tactic. There are 2 types that entail something more. Criminal rebellion is not intended to capture state power, but is very much associated with what this, some of the students of those phenomena call violent lobbying. So the idea is that for criminal groups to be able to engage into their business, sometimes they have to take on and face the state directly. This is what has been happening, for example, in Mexico, in which you have pitched battles between organized criminal groups and forces of the state. And the second thing is that sometimes the logic of elimination is what drives non-coercive state violence, even though there are many arguments making the case that eliminationist violence is also used in order to establish state power. Let me discuss very quickly the implications. I think that by having this kind of integrated approach, we can achieve a number of improvements. The first one is to move away from interminable discussions about ontologies. What is genocide or what is not? We can define it in a very simple way as demographic engineering and identify it with a way that is fairly simple, I think. But the most important thing is we can disaggregate complex events and integrate them again. So instead of discussing whether the troubles in Northern Ireland are a civil war or an instance of terrorism or an instance of colonial violence or an instance of genocide, we can actually disaggregate it into a set of discrete processes and argue that it begins perhaps as clandestine violence and evolves into civil war, then becomes a form of, you could say, almost interstate war and so on and so forth. We can do so with a small number of concepts, and we can agree that a variety of concepts that are used in a way that is very arbitrary can be subsumed under a single category. For example, things like pogroms, riots, lynching, vigilantism, communal war can be understood as being part of intercommunal violence. We can organize the study of dimensions. We can study intents, causes, outcomes of every kind of phenomena. We can redefine those concepts. For example, understanding terrorism not something that is a characteristic of actors we do not like, or as something that applies broadly to non-state actors that target civilians, is a form of rebellion in which clandestinity is the fundamental aspect of it. We can minimize overlaps. For example, presently, the main data set on terrorism includes incidents that take place within civil wars, so that we cannot separate really the two concepts. We can address long-standing debates. For example, the critique to terrorism that doesn't focus on states is taken care of by the fact that there is a category called state violence. And we can have new ways of understanding how to classify phenomena such as lone wolf terrorism or hate crime in a way, I think, that is more consistent analytically with the very simple definitions that I've offered. The second implication is that this kind of approach offers us a new vocabulary to describe very complex events that have taken place in the past. I gave you the example of the Northern Ireland Troubles, which can be disaggregated and redescribed, or the Colombian violencia, which some people describe as a war, others describe as a coup, others describe as riots. The Israel-Palestine conflict, which also can be disaggregated into discrete events. but also make sense of things that otherwise are difficult to understand. For example, the civil wars that took place during the Second World War. The developments, for example, in Ukraine during the Second World War, which are incredibly difficult to classify and politically extremely complex to approach. Sudan is a recent example. You could think of something in December 2018 is described as a Sudanese revolution, is followed by a coup, is followed by mass protests, then becomes a civil war, as a set of discrete things in which political violence morphs from one type into another, and then asking why and how this transformation takes place. And finally, we can discuss how these forms of violent political conflict are linked to each other, and I'm going to conclude with that. And I think there are 4 interesting connecting logics that can be identified and studied. The way I approach it is if a form of conflict takes place at the same time with another one, it is simultaneous. If one gives the way to another, it's sequential. If one form of conflict is strategic, that is, it is implemented in a sort of conscious way, in a planned way, then it is strategic. Otherwise, it is the unintentional result of other factors. So if you cross those 2 dimensions, you have four forms of interaction. The first form, which is the one here, which I call externality, is when you have the breakout of a violent political conflict, say an interstate war, within which creates in an unintentional way dynamics that produce another form of political violence. So, for example, the invasion of Germany in France in 1940 eventually produces a civil war within France as an externality. If we have a situation of sequential but unintentional relation, then we have a transformation. A transformation is a situation in which, for example, the Syrian revolution fails and gets transformed into a civil war. When the revolution started, nobody was planning a civil war, but it was the result of the failure of the Syrian state to suppress the revolution and the failure of the revolutionaries to win with the revolution. And therefore, we get a transformation from a civilian revolution into a militarized one. And if we look at the second column, we have a situation of instrumental relation when a form of political violence is deployed strategically to achieve another one. For example, the way in which the Rwandan genocide was implemented was through communal violence, by mobilizing masses of Hutu peasants to massacre the Tutsi minority. The same is true about the German Holocaust in the Soviet Union. Very often it took the form of communal violence, the mobilization of local militias and local villagers to target and attack Jewish populations. And finally, we have a very interesting and methodologically consequential type of relation, what I call substitution, when one form of political violence is used because another one which is preferred is not possible. So clandestine violence or terrorism is very often what is being used when a civil war is not possible. Because a civil war, that is the mobilization of an army to fight against the state, is not possible when you have strong states, sometimes you choose to fight clandestinely. And that's why we have this very powerful finding that terrorism is associated with strong states as opposed to weak states. So substitution is a very interesting and methodologically consequential logic because it alerts us to counterfactuals which we often do not take seriously when we study the causes of conflict. Because very often certain types of conflict are the result of the fact that other forms of conflict were not possible. And so we need to think about what were the choices of actors. And they were not just choices between nonviolence and violence, but choices between different forms of violence. So I'll stop here. I'm not going to develop those examples more. And just say that I offer this kind of team as a way to make sense both of a reality that is so complex that is very difficult to handle, but also as a way to try to use existing research that is extremely insightful and rich, but produced in a way that makes it very often of very limited use otherwise. And so the objective here is to find how different forms of political violence are connected with each other as a way to understand how political violence happens. I think it's both more modest and more ambitious at the same time. And I would say, by way of conclusion, that the objective is not necessarily to convince everyone to use these new classifications, especially because of sunk costs and existing fields. People have very little incentive to move away. But by offering, in a way, the possibility of new findings, of new questions to be asked, of new connections between forms of violence that were seen as unconnected, to offer a new research agenda that is going to be the motivation for people who have no existing commitments or loyalties in existing research silos to undertake new and hopefully fruitful research. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I didn't confuse you too much. And we have some time to discuss, and you have the opportunity to ask me any question you may want to ask me. So thank you very much.